Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. Today is the 11th day of May. It's hard to believe we're moving towards the midpoint of the year 2015. It's really, really difficult to believe. It's flying by. Today is the 11th day of May. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I want to apologize for not being able to do a program this past Wednesday, but the reason I do is because I got a couple of emails from people that thought it might be because I was having an illness of some sort. It was my internet was down, and I spent better than almost an hour prior to program time trying to get the internet up and working, and I couldn't do it. It came back that night about 11:30 at night. Before I went to bed, I tried it, and it was working. So, and it's been working ever since. So I'm holding my breath. But the one thing I could say is that so it was not an illness, except in today's communication world, losing internet connection is the equivalent to being ill. So, but anyway, that's really all there was. It was a technological issue, a technical issue, not anything about me. Anyway, I'm so glad to be back with you. I welcome you to today's program. I invite you to participate actively in it by giving us a call. I'm quite interested. I'm already quite excited about the fact Bob Kincaid has made some technical changes, upgrades, if you will, in some of the technology. And I can tell the difference from my end just in talking back and forth with him prior to the program. The sound, the clarity, and the strength of the signal seems to be so much more pronounced. And I'm wondering, and I'm hoping that might be true for you out there as well. So, you know, if you do experience improvement in the technology, I wish you don't even, if you don't feel like calling me and getting on the air here at the Virtual Center, I would encourage you to call the horn and let Bob Kincaid know, because I know he's worked very, very hard to make these changes. Our phone number is, which is there for you, and we would love to hear from you, is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And as you know, 4676 translates into horn, H-O-R-N. If you call that number, you will be into the studios, into the Head On Radio Network studios, and you will have the chance to communicate directly with Bob Kincaid. So, if you do have input or comments on the improvements in the technology and would like to share them with Bob, I would invite you. That's the number you want to call, 663-4676, area code 304. If you would like to communicate directly with me on some of the issues and the topics we've been dealing with here at the Virtual Center, I would love to hear from you. I've heard over the weekend from 3 or 4 of you. In fact, that's where the issue about my possibly being ill last Wednesday, and that's why we were not able to do a program. That's where it came from. A couple of very, very nice listeners who were a little bit concerned that I might be under the weather, and it's really encouraging when you're absent. When your absence causes people to think you might be a little bit under the weather. It's when your presence seems to suggest to people that you might be under the weather that there's a real problem, and that's the one I'm dreading. But anyway, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 @gmail.com. I want to open today's. First of all, I'm hoping that some of the things that I had hoped to do last Wednesday when we were unable to do the program. That's really my game plan today, is to finish that. In one way, I was quite disappointed about not being able to do Wednesday's program because it followed so logically from the programs we did last week on Monday and Tuesday, the first two. If you remember, we were focusing on jobs. More specifically, we were focusing on the connection, or the link, if you will, between job as opposed to career. And more specifically, what we were after are those fringes, if you will, that many, many people assume come from work. We know that a job pays an income, generates income. We know that. It sustains material life, if you will, in our contemporary society. What we were looking at are the other factors that are associated with work, and that goes all the way back into our tradition and into our culture here in Western civilization, and the idea that along with an income, work builds things like self-sufficiency and independence, the ability to communicate more effectively, interpersonal skills, the ability to work more closely and more positively and efficiently with others, the issue of ethics and morality are so closely associated with this. The idea that in the world of work, theoretically, positive actions, positive behavior is rewarded, negative behavior is discouraged, and these things kind of build a sense of independence and a sense of self-sufficiency and all of these self-reliance and all of these things that we take for granted. And that's what we spent a good portion of our time talking about last Monday and Tuesday. And as I was trying to set up or lay out a plan for Wednesday's program, it seemed to fit so logically into it. I had mentioned that I had received this incredibly rich email from our friend Harry in Baltimore, who sent us, gave us a lot of the information we looked at a couple of weeks ago when the situation in Baltimore exploded, theoretically, when the demonstrations became violent, the killing of Freddie Gray, and the indictment on a week ago Friday, the indictment of the 6 police officers, and followed by a number of very positive demonstrations. Harry had sent us an awful lot of information about Baltimore. Many of you will remember, week before last, he spent quite a bit of time on the air with us. We had a wonderful exchange, wonderful discussion, talking about the situation in Baltimore, talking about some of the issues that seem to be fomenting and sustaining the demonstrations and the anger, if you will, that seem to surface in reaction to the death of Freddie Gray. Well, last Tuesday, I believe, prior to the time we went on the air, Harry sent us another email. Sent me another email. And in that email, he had sent me an extensive number of paragraphs from books written by the sociologist Richard Sennett. And last Tuesday, at the end of the program, I was basically talking about the rich nature of this contribution, of this attachment that Harry sent me. And I wanted to spend some time going into Richard Sennett's information, thanks to Harry, because it fits so logically and connected so easily with the 2 programs that we had done on work and on careers, the whole issue of jobs. More specifically, what Harry was able to do was excerpt key paragraphs from 2 or 3 of the books that Richard Sennett has written over the years. The first one written in 1973, I think you can tell how much time I spend in the 18th century. Every time somebody asks me what year it is, I begin with 17, and that's not true, of course. 1972 was the first book that Richard Sennett had written. And it was basically it was entitled The Injuries of Class. And the second one was written in the 90s, 1993, I believe, on the issue of work, on the issue of how individuals can fit in and make it and survive and flourish in a rapidly changing environmental work environment, if you will. Basically, what we were talking about in the 90s was the emergence of the positives as well as the negatives associated with globalism, with global capitalism. And then in 2006, Richard Sennett wrote another book, and this one, let me be specific because I don't want to misquote. The title of this book is The Culture of the New Capitalism. And actually, much of the material that Harry included in his email came from that particular book. Basically, what Richard Sennett's material deals with is the changing nature of work in today's rapidly changing world, economic world. And it seemed to me, given the fact that we had spent pretty much 2 full days on the idea of work itself and on the issues of so-called fringe benefits of work and whether in fact they really amount to fringes at all because they are so important to those values that we grow up cherishing in this society. We spent quite a bit of time on work as it affects the individual. What Richard Sennett's material deals with is the changing nature of work itself and what that is doing for or to individuals seeking to survive and to deal with this kind of disconcerting change. So I thought, and you know, that this seemed to flow so naturally from what we had done. It seemed to complete the picture. And in the background, you know, so on the back burner right now, we have this issue of religious freedom, which I'd like to deal with. I received an email this morning from one of our listeners who shared with me an article on Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and Thomas's position that the First Amendment on the establishment of religion applies only to the federal government, and that in his view it would be entirely consistent with the Constitution for an individual state to declare Christianity the official religion of that state. It would not violate the First Amendment in the thinking of Clarence Thomas. Again, it raises the whole issue of religious freedom in our society, where it fits and what it means and what it doesn't mean, and whether in fact it bodes well for the future of this nation or whether it doesn't. I think the issues are so important, so significant, and so frequent that I really do think that we need to spend some time dealing with the whole issues of religious freedom in our society, the idea of what we call separation of church and state, the authorship of the famous Virginia bill for religious freedom that was passed by the Virginia legislature in 1786 and no question became the basis for what becomes the religions portions of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. So I wanted to deal with that particular piece of legislation. I want to deal with Jefferson's efforts to pass it 9 years earlier during the War for Independence itself in 1777, and it's his inability to get it through the Virginia legislature during the war. And his thinking was that the pressures or the challenges of war probably were the best time to try to get this kind of religious freedom bill through the Virginia legislature, because everybody in Virginia was pulling in the same direction. And his feeling was, once the pressures of the war ended and people began to go their own ways and resume their own independent lives, it would be much more difficult to build the kind of momentum that Jefferson believed would be necessary to get this through the Virginia legislature. That, plus the opposition of some very prominent Virginians, the most important one, I think, being Patrick Henry, made it impossible to get that bill through in the 1770s. In the 1780s, Madison picks up the challenge, and he is successful in maneuvering the Religious Freedom Bill through the Virginia legislature. So I wanted to look at what they believed was the rationale or the benefits, the advantages of such a bill for religious freedom, what its implications were, what the threats to the nation, to society itself were from religion, and then look at some of the contemporary issues that are happening today related to the First Amendment. Until we finish this job, the situation on work, however, I think I'd like to postpone that until another day, and I'd like to spend the better time of our time today on Richard Sennett's material on work. Keep in mind that we would love to hear from you. Let me give you the phone number again. It is area code 304-663-4676. And again, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. Spend a little bit of time, a few moments ago, kind of reviewing some of the things that we talked about here at the Virtual Center related to jobs and work and the so-called fringe benefits of work, and whether, in fact, given some of the issues that we are facing in our society today, whether, in fact, these are fringe benefits at all. They might be the really integral key issues associated with the need to find ways to get people to work. As you know, we have a society which is suffering tremendously from unemployment, even though the politicos tell us that the economy is recovering, and that as the recession of 07 and 08 recede further and further in the rearview mirror, it looks like the economy is coming back. But as we know, and I think we hear this all the time, in fact, I'm afraid that we hear it so often that we would become rather immune to it, and I don't think we can afford to. The fact of the matter is, most of the people that are benefiting from the wealth that has been generated since the recession of 07 and 08 are the upper 1%. The fact of the matter is, the overall strength of the economy, while it has improved, has not improved for a large number of people, both as we would call in the middle and those people toward the bottom. Basically, many of the jobs that were lost will never come back. Many people who fruitlessly looked for work when they lost their job have been forced to take jobs that pay substantially less. Most of them, I would say, in the service sector. They're working in restaurants. They're working as waiters and dishwashers and receptionists and all of these things. But the real substantive kinds of jobs that drove American expansion, economic expansion after World War II, seem to be permanently gone. Many of them have gone overseas. Others have been replaced, if you will, by technology. And we haven't done very well in finding alternative work for too many of our people. The result is a significant proportion of our working age population is either unemployed or underemployed. And I don't think that we can overstress the importance of underemployment. And of course, what that means is people's ability to acquire jobs that neither match their talent and their skills nor their income needs. And so consequently, while the unemployment rates have gone down in recent months and over the last couple of years, the fact of the matter is the quality of life that's associated with the income generated by work has never really recovered. That, it seems to me, is the substance of what Richard Sennett's book on what he calls the culture of new capitalism is all about. What Richard Sennett is doing is explaining the changes in capitalism itself that have happened in recent years and are continuing to happen, and what those changes mean for people. More specifically, what we need to do, if there is indeed anything we can do, what we need to do in order to find solutions to the problems associated with what he calls the new capitalism, namely the displacement of significant numbers of people in jobs. And so what I'd like to do, and a lot of this is going to be direct quotations because that's what Harry sent me, was relevant paragraphs, if you will, from Sennett's work. And his selection was unbelievable because I find that almost every paragraph he sent me seems to say something significant and important. I also want to share with you the fact, and this is, again, a statement of gratitude to Harry for his work, that this attachment that he sent me totaled something like 35 pages. And it was emailed in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, which suggests to me that an awful lot of work on Harry's part went into this email. I thanked him last Tuesday. I want to take this opportunity to thank him again. I am hoping that you will appreciate, after we deal with some of this, why I believe it's so important. In a sense, then, if I am successful in conveying to you what I think are the significance of some of the things that Richard Sennett is writing about, then you too will owe a debt of gratitude to Harry. I think that's really what the Virtual Center and what the Hit On Radio Network generally feeds off of, so to speak, is that kind of camaraderie and that kind of sharing and shared thinking and support and that kind of thing, where we can all benefit from what each one of us has to contribute to the good of the whole. And I think Harry's done yeoman work on this, and I want to thank you for it. What I'd like to do first, however, is I'd like to share you the portion of the email that Harry sent me this morning, taken from yesterday's Baltimore Sun. And most specifically, this relates to quotations from John D'Angelo, who is the owner of the Baltimore Orioles. And usually the owners of professional baseball teams and football teams and hockey teams and soccer teams and all the rest of it aren't that visible. They usually try to stay in the background as much as they can. So here's this young guy here. The story in the Baltimore Sun identified him as 47 years old. And his dad, Peter D'Angelo, bought the team, founded the team, and clearly had a clear social conscience for many of the things he did. He was an attorney. He made a large portion of his money in representing people with asbestos problems in the labor force. He came close to see, he could see the dangers and the threats to individual workers' health and all the rest of it. In other words, his work, his life, brought him into close contact with working people. And as a result, he developed the kind of social conscience that made it possible for him, as he became more and more successful, to share that success with some of the people that he believed could benefit most from it. And it's clear from the quotation that I will read you in a moment that his son John shares the same kind of social conscience. It's pretty powerful stuff about the situation in Baltimore, the riots, the violence, and what it seems to say to all of us, the challenge that it presents to all of us. So if I can, let me just read this section, this statement, because these are quotations patched together from John Angelo's tweets during the Baltimore situation, and these were printed in yesterday's Baltimore Sun. This is all a quote. Speaking for myself, I agree with your point that the principle of peaceful, nonviolent protest and the observance of the rule of law is of utmost importance in any society. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Mandela, and all great opposition leaders throughout history have always preached this precept, nonviolent protest. Further, it is critical that in any democracy, investigation must be completed and due process must be honored before any government or police members are judged responsible. And of course, this plays into the indictment. This refers obviously to the indictment of 6 police officers in the Baltimore police force. That said, John Angelos goes on, my greater source of personal concern, outrage, and sympathy beyond this particular case is focused neither upon one night's property damage nor upon the acts of a group, but is focused rather upon the past 4-decade period during which an American political elite have shipped middle-class and working-class jobs away from Baltimore and cities and towns around the United States to third-world dictatorships like China and others, plunging tens of millions of good, hard-working Americans into economic devastation, and then followed that action around the nation by diminishing every American civil rights protections in order to control an unfairly impoverished population living under an ever-declining standard of living and suffering at the butt end of an ever more militarized and aggressive surveillance state. That sentence is a long one, but boy, does it say a lot. And again, I think it is significant that this statement comes from John Angelos, owner of the Baltimore Orioles. He says that and I'm going back for a moment, he says that his concern, his outrage, and his sympathy go beyond the particular issue of demonstrations in Baltimore and is not focused on only one night's property damage or on the acts of any particular group. But his anger, concern, and sympathy are focused on what he defines is a 4-decade period during which an American elite, political elite, have shipped middle-class and working-class jobs away from Baltimore and cities and towns around the United States to third world dictatorships like China and others, plunging tens of millions of good, hard-working Americans into economic devastation, and then followed that action by diminishing every American's civil rights protections in order to control an unfairly impoverished population living under an ever-declining standard of living and suffering at the butt end of an ever more militarized and aggressive surveillance state. I guess if we were to summarize or to put that into perhaps more direct and meaningful language, I don't know if it can be in more meaningful language than it currently is. But what Mr. Angelos is saying, I keep calling him DeAngelos, and I know it's John Angelos. What Mr. Angelos is saying basically is that those that he terms part of an American political elite are responsible for shipping millions of good jobs out of the country, thereby rendering huge numbers of working people in trouble, putting them in trouble. And then, as the situation became more and more dire, the state turned around and began to take a more militarized, hard-nosed position against the violence that those kinds of actions precipitated. Now, again, I've read accounts which suggest that this is perhaps oversimplified, that there's much more to what's going on in American cities than simply the outsourcing of jobs. That in a sense, that while it's important, many economists point out that there are a number of other things involved. I would suggest to you the major thing that seems to be involved is a redefinition throughout this entire process by government on the public interest. It is very clear that government has allowed itself, during this 4-decade period that Angelos refers to, has allowed itself to regress into the agent that protects the freedom of those who were responsible initially for the outsourcing. In other words, what that suggests is that government's sense of a responsibility to the public interest, which involve things like trying to find ways to keep people working and recognizing that an employed society, a working society, is a healthy society, and instead backing off the issues of regulation and social management, allowed the system, if you will, to have its head without regulation or without controls, and then basically became more militaristic once the results of this were becoming more and more clear. I would suggest to you that really what Mr. Angelos is pointing out to here is a shifting of responsibility on the part of government from the way it looks at the public interest. The whole idea of the public interest, theoretically, is to manage society in such a way that people become the priority. Not the system, not the institution, not the freedom of a few at the expense of the many and all the other things that you could make out of this. I think that this is an extremely powerful statement. Angelos goes on. The innocent working families of all backgrounds whose lives and dreams have been cut short by excessive violence, surveillance, and other abuses of the Bill of Rights by government pay the true price, an ultimate price, and one that far exceeds the importance of any kids game played tonight or ever at Camden Yards. And what he's talking about here is the decision that the Orioles made to cancel the first game, play the second game with no fans allowed in the stadium, and then take the next series that was supposed to be 3 games with the Tampa Bay Rays in Baltimore and shift them to Tampa. And so basically, part of this is in reaction to people who felt that the games should not have been suspended or the scene of the games shifted. Angelo's position is that the damage being done to families, to working families, is much more important than a ball game. He says, quote, "We need to keep in mind people are suffering and dying around the United States, and while we are thankful no one was injured at Camden Yards, there's a far bigger picture for poor Americans in Baltimore and everywhere who don't have jobs and are losing economic, civil, and legal rights. And this makes the inconvenience at a ball game irrelevant in light of the needless suffering that it is inflicting upon ordinary Americans." It sounds like Angelos said what many, many people believed this was about. And I think what makes it relevant not only is what he said, but who he is. I think that's very, very important. I want to thank Harry for sharing that with me so that I can share it with you. And I don't want to go into this particular issue any further because I'd like to get to the material from Richard Sennett and focus the rest of our program today on that. But again, if you do have reaction to this and to the role of John Angelos and to this particular quotation, then by all means, I do invite you to pick up the phone and give us a call. We would love to hear from you. Let me. I've been trying to figure out, and Bob Kincaid made a comment to me before he went on the air, and suggested sometimes that I overthink some of this stuff, and maybe do that too often. But I guess that comes from my years of standing up before a classroom. And it seems to me that while you have a wealth of information in hand, how you present it and how you organize it is really significant, because it's going to determine whether, in fact, the benefits of that information get to other people besides you. And so I've wrestled and played around with what the best strategy would be of dealing with this material from Richard Sennett's books. And I guess my conclusion was that the best thing to do is just take it in pieces and not try to create a holistic global view of the issue. Sennett begins his introduction to the culture of the new capitalism with the following quotation. I've read this quotation 4 or 5 times, and the first 2 or 3 times I didn't really believe that it said as much as I realize it does after the 4th and 5th time. So maybe it's me, maybe I'm getting slow. But let me share it with you, because I think this paragraph says a lot, this quotation says a lot. Richard Sennett says the following in his introduction to this book. What I want to show is how society goes about searching for this ideal man or woman. And I'll step beyond the scholar's remit in judging that search. A search that is self-oriented to the short-term, focused on potential ability, willing to abandon past experiences, is, to put a kindly face on the matter, an unusual sort of human being. In other words, if we are looking for the ideal man and the ideal woman in society, in today's world, then what Sennett's work in this book is going to come up with is a definition of the ideal man or the ideal woman that is going to make most of us pretty darn uncomfortable. The reasons for that are that as you look at today's society, he says, what we're talking about when we talk about ideals are self-interested people, self-oriented people, focused on the short term, not the long term, focused on potential ability, not accomplishment, willing to abandon past experience. All of this, it seems to me, describes the ideal person as defined by today's working world. He said, to put it kindly, this is an unusual sort of human being. Most people are not like this, Sennett says. They need a sustaining life narrative. They take pride in being good at something specific, and they value the experiences they've lived through. The cultural ideal required in new institutions thus damages many of the people who inhabit them. After reading all of the information, in other words, after reading what I believe is the essence of the message that Sennett's book is delivering, and coming to appreciate what he's saying about the changes in our institutions and the changes in people that are necessary in order to navigate those changes, I've come to appreciate this quote, because I really do believe that Sennett has nailed it. The person that our contemporary world of work seems to define as ideal is a person that would make all of us uncomfortable. Because we have grown up in a world, in a culture, which has put a premium on characteristics, behavior traits that are quite different. Sennett says most people are not like this ideal person in today's changing world. They need a sustaining life narrative. I spent some time reflecting on the issue of life narrative and what that means. Life narrative, as I understand it, means learning from your experiences, growing, developing, learning from your mistakes, learning from past opportunities, being able to take skills, things that you learned in one situation, and being able to transfer that learning into a totally different situation so that that learning becomes valuable. Not looking at every isolated situation or every isolated thing that happens in your life as an independent, separate thing from everything else. Instead, life narrative seems to suggest that what we ultimately are as people stems from the sum total of all the experiences, all the human interactions, all the people we've known, the books we've read, the places we've visited, the people we've interacted with. And as a result of that, we tend to grow as people. And so that at any point in time, what we are is the result or the basis of what Sennett calls a life narrative. What he is suggesting in what he calls the New Capitalism, which is the title of his book, what he's suggesting is that today's world, the ideal person in today's world, has nothing to gain or benefit by life narrative. That's not the person we're looking for anymore. We're looking for a person who's free. And I'm focusing here on the word freedom as it's used so frequently in today's society by politicians and talk show hosts and everybody else. Every time something is wrong, the argument is the way to make it right is to basically restore people's freedom. The implication is that freedom is the right to do whatever you want. What Sennett is suggesting then is if today's world doesn't really seem to place any value on a life narrative, then what that means is that today's working world doesn't really assign any value to what people who develop through the process of a life narrative bring to the table. Many of the things, or most of the things that we grew up valuing in today's new capitalism, if you will, are considered redundant or unnecessary or not critical to what today's working world is looking for. And if you recall in the first part of that statement, he talked about people whose priorities are self-interested, who always look to the short term, who focus on potential ability, not accomplishments. People who are willing to abandon past experience. That is the exact opposite of a life narrative. Because that is suggesting that if you allow the elements of a life narrative to shape you, if you allow the past to be a key factor in who you are, if you are changed, limited, directed, if you will, by past experiences, then you aren't mobile enough, you aren't nimble enough, you aren't flexible enough to meet the needs in the new capitalism that Sennett is talking about. So again, what he says is most people that we know aren't like this. People that we know need a sustaining life narrative. Let me go on. They take pride in being good at something specific. And they value the experiences they've lived through. The cultural ideal required in new institutions thus damages many of the people who inhabit them. What we're talking about here is a workforce, not just in Baltimore or not just in America, but we're talking about the developed, increasingly global economy, if you will. What we are talking about is flexibility and mobility, nimbleness, not being anchored or chained by experiences that limit your flexibility. Consequently, all of the things that we grew up valuing now become liabilities. And that is the introductory quote that Richard Sennett begins in his introduction to his discussion of this particular work, this particular book, which he calls The Culture of the New Capitalism. Then he goes on after that quote, and he talks in very general terms about the issues that he's going to address. He says the chapters that follow treat three subjects. First, how institutions are changing. Second, how fears about being made redundant or left behind are related to talent in the so-called skills society. And third, how consumption behavior relates to political attitudes. That's really what his book is about. Basically what he's suggesting then, and this is a quote from him, the apostles of the new capitalism argue that their version of these three subjects, work, talent, consumption, add up to more freedom in modern society, a fluid freedom, a liquid modernity, in the apt phrase of the philosopher Zygmunt Bauman. And then Sennett says straight up, I challenge this. I refuse to accept this, but this is it. And then he proceeds to lay out the narrative to help us, the reader, all of us as readers, understand the ingredients of the institutions and the contradictions, if you will, between the priorities of today's institutions and the priorities of the people who work and live in them. The implication then is, if we are going to do something positive in order to deal with these realities in today's world, the first thing that we're going to have to do is acknowledge a problem. I think that this is what Richard Sennett has done, and I can't tell you how grateful I am to Harry for introducing me to some of this stuff, because it answered a lot of questions in my research, in my thinking, because I've done an awful lot of thinking and reflecting and reading over the years about the relationship between work and the people who do it, what effects, positive and negative, work, the world of work, has on people. But obviously where I'm most deficient is on the internal ingredients of today's institutions and the kind of changes that they are demanding from people who live in them and work in them. It seems to me without that piece, the story is rather incomplete. So again, I think that the value of Sennett's book is laying out and explaining the nature of the disconnect and the factors which contribute to it. And if he is successful, it's going to cause those people who can potentially do something about it to begin taking the nature of the challenges seriously. I think that's the significance. I think that's our challenge here at the Virtual Center, and that's what I hoped to do. Sennett opens his book in the first chapter by introducing us to a German word. And that word is Bildung. B-I-L-D-U-N-G. Bildung. Sennett defines the meaning of Bildung. So let me share with you his definition of it, and then why I think this is a relevant concept. Sennett says, the German word Bildung names a process of personal formation which fits a young person for the lifelong conduct of life. Bildung is the process that he called in his introduction the life narrative. The life narrative is Bildung. It's the process by which people become who they are. They develop, they learn, their experiences, their contexts, their interactions, their heritage, their genetics, all of those things that affect who they are and what they become. That is what the term Bildung means. In the 19th century, during the height of the Industrial Revolution, Sennett says, the focus of Bildung was on institutions, people working in factories, and what that required. And I'm getting a little bit excited about this because I really do believe it's important stuff. But if you think about working in factories, and I know I've shared with you my own personal experience. I worked in a paper mill right after high school for 3 years before I went to college. And I worked in a bakery through college, weekends and full-time in the summers. So I worked in industry. And basically, as a result of that background, I was quite taken with some of the psychological and sociological research that defined the ideal worker in that kind of a situation. The person who spends their working hours doing the same thing over and over and over and over, and being responsible for not only doing it efficiently, but doing it well. And what that would do to people's self-concept, self-image. What happens to people that spend a significant portion of their working lives in that kind of an environment, where for most people there aren't all that many decisions to make? Somebody else is being paid to make those for you. The benefits, obviously, come from the relationships you develop with the people you work with. But again, they, as you, are being rewarded for doing what the system demands and are punished for not doing that. So consequently, your contacts tend to be with people who oftentimes think the same, have many of the same interests, probably don't read a lot, probably don't spend a lot of time into philosophy and those kinds of things, probably spend most of the time in what they have and in what they can consume. The car they drive, the size of the home they live in, the neighborhood they live in, the kind of vacations they can afford to take. So while and I found this to be incredibly positive in my experience in the workforce, in industry. And that is, to a fault, almost everybody I encountered was quite aware of what they were not experiencing. Most of the people that I met were quite aware that what they were doing was the grunt work so that their children would never have to do this. They worked hard, they were responsible, they were dependable, they were trustworthy, they were good people. I loved the experience. And I loved the people that I worked with. I still remember them. It was 45 years ago. But that was the Bildung. The Bildung of the industrial age was adjusting to the demands of its institutions. The institutions were defined almost completely by the idea of the factory. And not only did individuals have to adjust to this, but society itself adjusted to this. Think of our school systems, our K through 12 schools. Think of the fact that children, from the very beginning of their enrollment in school, are taught to respond to bells and whistles. They are told when to speak, told when to stand, told when to sit, told when to be silent, told to keep their eyes straight forward, told not to slump. And what I'm suggesting is the entire culture was oriented towards producing the ideal worker as defined by the institutions in which they would work and ultimately live. In the 20th century, and Sennett does this, I've read two or three of these. He talks about, in the early 20th century, books like William White's The Organization Man, C. Wright Mills's White Collar, Michael Crozier's Bureaucracy. These are the people who wrote about what in fact people were about in the 1950s, in the 1960s, at the height of industrialism. The jobs, and of course the unions formed, the salaries increased, the fringe benefits increased. The GI Bill made it popular for many people coming out of the war, many of the young people, to go to college, and the whole Bildung, if you will, associated with social mobility and moving up the social ladder was underway. That was the Bildung of the 19th and 20th centuries. But what has happened now? What does Richard Sennett see as being the essence of the so-called new capitalism? Let me read this quote, and then we'll take our break. We've gone a little bit beyond the top of the hour. But let me, since I've set up this quote, I want to compare it with the last one because it's part of the new Bildung, if you will. What he calls the fresh page thesis, that the new capitalism is definitely a form of progress in global economic life. The so-called new capitalism asserts that the institutions which enabled this life narrative thinking have now, quote, melted into air, unquote. The militarization of social time is coming apart. There are some obvious institutional facts on which this thesis is founded. The end of lifetime employment is one such, as is the waning of careers spent within a single institution. The old idea of people going into a career or a world of work, a kind of work, and working at that through their entire working lives. Or better yet, going and accepting employment and staying with the same employer for 30, 40, 50 years, getting the gold watch when you retire, and all the rest of it is gone. It's all, as he says, melted into air. He quotes George Soros, the financial guru and owner of the Houston baseball team of basketball? I'm not sure. But anyway, George Soros encapsulates or summarizes these changes by saying that what used to be what are now transactions have replaced what used to be relationships in people's dealings with each other. The immense growth of the world economy is cited by others as possible only because institutional controls on the flow of goods, services, and labor have become less coherent. These have enabled an unprecedented number of migrants to inhabit the so-called gray economies of large cities. The collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1989 is cited by others as having paid for what he calls the institutional order in which military regulation and civil society become indistinguishable. That's the definition of the new capitalism that Sennett implies is the new Bildung. That's the new world to which people who grew up in the old one are being forced to adjust. Sennett is going to share with us the fact that this new world is quite different than the old one. And ironically, and he doesn't say this in so many words, but I'm going to say it, ironically, one of the major changes is that through the 20th century into the 20th century, there was always the idea that society needed to keep its people employed. It was a positive good. And in part, it was government's responsibility to do everything that it could do so that nobody felt redundant, nobody felt useless, nobody felt as if they didn't matter. Because there was so much about the world of work at that time that indicated that you really weren't a person, you were a machine. And it seemed to me there was a social responsibility on the part of many people that we had to do everything that we could do in order to counter the more negative aspects of the industrial Bildung. Today, there's no such sense of social responsibility. Larger and larger numbers of people are being dislocated and displaced. And while people worry about the problem, the institutions that people are committed to seem to demand that there's nothing we can do about those problems. That's the issue we're into. It's 10 minutes after the hour. Let's pause for 5 minutes, and then we'll be right back, and we'll go back into this story of Richard Sennett. This is Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a brief break, we'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I apologize for the telephone in the background, but I'm not answering it. I thank you if you are just joining us. Welcome to today's program at the Virtual Center. If you've been with us through our first hour, we thank you for staying with us. Our topic today is on the changing nature of work in today's global economy, as it will. We're focusing on excerpts from the work of Richard Sennett, sociologist, a well-known sociologist who's written a number of books. And we're indebted to one of our listeners from Baltimore, Harry, who makes us aware, who put these paragraphs from Sennett's works together and sent them to me via email. And I don't know whether he expected or intended that I would make as much of them here at the Virtual Center as I have, but I think they are so valuable. And the insight that he provides us, it seems to me, is valuable. I hope you'll agree. We do have a phone number. We would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on some of these things. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. To briefly get back to where we were in Richard Sennett's thinking, in his first chapter, what Richard Sennett sets out to do in what he calls the new cap is to define for us the nature of the so-called new capitalism. And what basically this does is to look at the issue of bureaucracy, institutions, the structure of our institutions, which has helped shape our culture, our character. It's so responsible for who we are. It is, in his terms, the essence of our life narrative. It's what makes us who we are. It's what causes us to value what we value. All of it. And his point is that this Bildung, this German word for the process which helps develop life, our lives as it were, is changing. And the height of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, the bureaucratic structure and people's need to adjust to it defined the Bildung of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It began to define our organizations, our bureaucracies at all levels. And we mentioned White's book on The Organization Man, if any of you have read that book. And basically, it doesn't deal with the factory, but it deals with the concept of bureaucracy and what bureaucracy demands of those people as they seek to adjust to it. It talks about the modern corporation. It talks about the so-called company man. It talks about the person who is very satisfied to be a mid-level executive who is largely invisible. It doesn't necessarily talk about leadership so much. It talks mostly about followerships and getting along and not making waves and getting rewarded for getting work done in a way which makes it seem almost automatic, in a way which almost makes you seem machine-like. And those are the kinds of books I can remember in the mid-50s. These were the kinds of books that were coming out. Books by Vance Packard on status seekers, for example. And White Collar. C. Wright Mills's book on white collar, which is the nature of modern white collar work, and how it too was modeled on the bureaucratic structure, the same kind of, quote, Bildung, unquote, that governed work in the factories. So basically what that meant was the way to get ahead, to quote the very popular expression, the way to get ahead is to get along. And the rewards are material rewards. They are an income. They are in improving your where you live, the neighborhood and the homes that you are enabled to buy, what you drive, all of these things. We become a consumer-focused society, as it were, which is the reward system for going along. And then, as Richard Sennett tells us, in the late 20th and 21st centuries, substantial changes began to happen associated with the expansion of global economy. And the definition, if you will, of bureaucratic need began to change. Richard Sennett identifies three major changes that began in the late 20th century that to him indicate that the idea of social capitalism, the idea that capitalism had any accountability or any responsibility for the people that lived within it, was, as he calls it, a nostalgic memory. In other words, he says that these three changes to our economic institutions probably did the most to change the Bildung into the so-called new capitalism that he's defining for us today. The first major change or major shift, Richard Sennett says, is the shift in the world of work, in the corporate world, from managerial to shareholder power. We're talking here about the private sector, of course. The shift from managerial power to shareholder power in the largest companies. This is the point at which capitalism really exploded into a more global phenomenon. Capitalism has always been global. We talked about trade. We talked about colonies. There are a number of books out now pointing out the extent to which slavery was but a labor form, a form of capitalism. It was driven and supported by capitalism, by financial capitalism. Richard Sennett says that you can trace the beginnings of this shift from managerial to shareholder power back to the 1970s. That was when wealth, I'm quoting him directly, wealth which had been confined to local or national enterprises or stored in national banks could much more easily move around the globe. giant pension funds and small private investors followed this lead in the 1980s and 1990s, looking for new offshore opportunities. I can remember this. I'm sure many of you do as well. When within the world of work, the emphasis shifted from pensions into IRAs. And the role that government played in persuading people to abandon pensions in favor of IRAs, because it made it possible for you to own and control your own retirement. Instead of your employer dictating that when you retire in 25, 30, or 40 years from now, you will get a pension of X amount of dollars per week or per month or whatever it was. You knew, you had the security to know that when you retired, you would receive a certain amount. But the fact of the matter is, if you shifted employers, if you left that job, you lost your pension. You lost your retirement program. Consequently, all of the incentives were there to keep you working in the same place for the same employer for incredibly long periods of time. But once the shift occurred, and once people began to opt out of pensions in favor of becoming investors in the stock market, believing that they could reap the same kind of rewards, the same level of return on investments that the big guys were getting, government was in large part responsible for selling that message. Consequently, more and more companies, first of all, made IRAs available, optional, and then increasingly made them mandatory. And government followed suit. Government employees, municipal employees, state employees, federal employees followed suit. And the old idea of the established government pension idea was abandoned in favor of a retirement program which you, the employee, owned and could control. That meant that you could change jobs, move from job to job, and take your retirement with you. In other words, it gave you, quote, freedom. And that becomes the essence of the new capitalism, is this kind of freedom. And so, in a sense, what was happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is that people's loyalty, the strings that kept people connected to the same workplace, were gradually being cut, being severed. All in the interests, in the name of freedom. That is one of the major changes that occurred in the late 20th century. And all of those pension funds that had been existent in order to pay employee pensions all of a sudden showed up in the stock market. And you can see that reflected in a Dow Jones average that used to be in the 700s and 800s and suddenly jumped up to the 1200s and 1300s because of the influx of all of this pension money in the 80s and 90s and early 21st century that went into it. Sennett goes on with this idea of the shift from managerial to shareholder power. He says, due to the emergence of sophisticated shareholder power, corporate generals at the top of the chain of command were not the generals they once were. A new source of lateral power had emerged at the top, often indifferent to the culture that long-term associations and alliances had forged within the corporation. Once power became shareholder power at the top, and once all of these shareholders were looking to take profit out of the company, then by definition, all the old ideas that shaped the life narrative of the people that worked there became inconsequential, if they were noticed or cared about at all. Not only that, but managers, company bosses, presidents, supervisors, who used to make decisions unilaterally, now were forced to make them in conjunction with shareholders, because the shareholders, in effect, became their bosses. Their accountability, their responsibility, increasingly became to shareholders, ceased to be any sense of real responsibility to the people they supervised. They took their marching orders from shareholders, not from those they managed. And this change, Sennett said, led logically to the next one. In other words, one change transitioned very easily into a second major change in institutional behavior, corporate behavior, at the beginning of the 21st century. And this was the shift from long-term results to short-term results, based on the demands of investors. These investors, one author refers to as examples of what he calls impatient capital. Investors are looking for immediate returns. Investors are not about buying stock long-term and holding it and receiving the dividends at the end of each year based on how well the company's doing. Up until this point, that's the way capitalism worked. That's what shareholders did. They bought shares of stock in a company, and you just kind of sat back and had total faith in the fact that the value of your stock eventually was going to go up. It was almost guaranteed, it seemed. But once power shifts to shareholders and investors, the emphasis shifts from long-term investment into short-term gains. Investors want a quick return. Consequently, the priorities of the corporation increasingly became measurements in order to demonstrate short-term gain rather than long-term security. And so the irony is that many of the arguments that were used to persuade working people to abandon their pensions in favor of stock investments turned out to be bogus. Because the fact of the matter is, people were being assured that if they bought their stock and sat on it and waited long enough, eventually it would go up. And people were told you can't measure it by the ups and downs on a daily or weekly basis of the Dow Jones average or the stock market or anything else. You need to look and think long term. Many of you on TV, and apparently the show has just recently ended, many of you over the years have watched Susie Orman, and she's always talking about the security and stability of the market and faith in long-term gain. And she's encouraging average people to invest wisely in, to invest in stock and hold on to it. But the fact of the matter is, investors who now became decision makers in corporate decisions were in it for the short haul, not the long haul. If they bought stock, they were primarily interested in stock that gained value so they could immediately turn it over and unload it. So what we have is a situation where the people at the bottom are being asked to have faith in the long-term stability of the market. But the fact of the matter is, the people that are playing with big bucks, the people at the top, are looking for short-term gain, and they are taking the profits right out of it as quickly as it is generated. So the fact of the matter is, where the benefits, the profits from the market were usually defined in dividends that companies paid at the end of a successful year, investors weren't willing to wait for that. To them, the value of the company was driven by the value of its stock. If you could unload stock at a profit and buy other stock cheap, then the way you made money was moving stock, or was moving money around, buying and selling. And born was this entire industry that we call today, for lack of a better term, day traders. People who spend their time sitting in front of computers making huge stock deals instantaneously. They are literally controlling what happens to the mass of the people that were drawn into the market for its stability. In effect, what they are doing is jeopardizing the very stability that brought the vast number of people into the market in the first place. Richard Sennett says that those two changes, the shift from managerial to shareholder power, and the fact that increasingly the focus shifted from long-term gain to short-term profit, changed the entire Bildung. Because for people who worked in this kind of an environment, the whole value system which defined the Bildung of the 19th and early 20th centuries changed. The things that were the most valuable no longer had value. Those characteristics, or those elements of behavior that were always looked down on, suddenly acquired value. Sennett gives us some numbers. He points out that in 1965, I think this is very significant, in 1965, American pension funds, companies who had their pension funds invested in stocks, held those stocks for an average of 46 months. By 2000, that average had dropped to 3.8 months. In other words, companies who were investing, who were playing the market, as it were, used to invest in stock for the long term. Because out of those profits, they had to pay pensions to their employees when they retired. And so therefore, the average length of stock ownership of pension funds in 1965 was 46 months. In 2000, it's 3.8 months. There's a third challenge associated with these two. And of course, the third challenge are the new technologies in communication and manufacturing. Sennett says communication on a global scale became instant. The growth of communications technology, Sennett says, meant that information could be formulated in unambiguous and thorough terms, disseminated in its original version throughout a corporation. This may not seem important, but I think you'll realize how very important it is. Email and the derivatives of email diminished the mediation and interpretation of commands and rules verbally passing down the chain of command. It used to be, in the old world of bureaucracy, for example, that if you were the president and there was a change in policy, you would send a memo to your managers, to your assistant presidents, and your supervisors. And they, in turn, would take your memo and deliver the message to the people they supervised. But with the idea of email, the idea of instantaneous communication, it became possible for everybody up and down the ladder of command, as it were, to see the same email. No longer was interpretation, changes in interpretation. Remember the old story it used to be, I used to hear this all the time, about rumors. If you start a rumor, each time it's repeated, it changes, the story changes, until by the time it comes back to you, you don't even recognize it. Because something seems to be lost or added in interpretation at each step or each stage. Instantaneous communications like email take away that issue of interpretation. Everybody gets the same information at the same time, and it's instantaneous. That results in much more centralization of decision making than ever before. That means that those who make decisions oftentimes make them without the input from people around them or the people who are going to be affected by the particular policy change or whatever. When communication was not instantaneous, before it became instantaneous, supervisors or presidents or whatever could send out trial balloons in order to get the response, to get the reaction, and take that reaction and make the changes in policy accordingly. So decisions, while they were slower, were oftentimes better. But with the communications revolution, the transmission of information became instant. The decision-making power became much more centralized. Consequently, many of the decisions that were being made were not good ones. There's another issue associated with technology, with the technological revolution and the communications revolution. Automation. The replacement of human labor with machine labor. All through history, there's been this debate about whether technology creates opportunity or destroys it. The degree to which technology destroys or costs jobs. The story in England, in the newly industrialized England in the 17th century, of the so-called Luddites. those who would sabotage the new machines because the workers realized that if the machines were successful, their job was terminated. And so what you had was a form of industrial warfare going on between companies seeking to produce things more efficiently and employees trying desperately to find ways to hang on to their jobs. There's always been the debate about the degree to which automation costs jobs, or whether in fact it creates more jobs because it makes more industry and innovation possible. Richard Sennett points out, however, that in this new capitalism, there is no debate. Automation costs jobs, lots of jobs. Not only in manufacturing, but in white-collar work as well. He mentions things like, and I think all of this we can relate to, he mentions things like barcode readers, voice recognition technologies, three-dimensional object scanners, micro machines that do the work of fingers. All of us have seen the automatic self-checkouts in supermarkets and department stores. And what is that doing to jobs? Most of us have seen the easy pass lanes on our interstate system, on our interstate highways. Obviously, every one of those easy pass lanes is a lane that does not employ an attendant at the toll booth. That's just a couple of examples. But the fact of the matter is, automation is a major factor in the new capitalism. It is displacing a lot of people all at once. It is disturbing and dislocating entire economies and nations. Richard Sennett mentions Bismarck in late 19th century Prussia. This is what he says. I think that these two sentences are very, very revealing. As Bismarck was the first to recognize, business growth generates social dislocation and unrest, threats which can be addressed by spreading out the employment base. Bismarck knew that the way you guarantee order and stability in society is to spread out the employment base, so even though there's technological change, people aren't losing jobs. Then Sennett points out this: to create jobs for all in this old way now is to defy or ignore modern technological power. The key to today's technological revolution is its ability to eliminate jobs, which is a way to eliminate costs, which is a way to improve the bottom line. Given that mission, given that objective, given that that's what the company is in business about, there's no way that corporations in the new economy can forego consideration of the bottom line in order to keep large numbers of people working. They can't afford to do it. And the fact of the matter is, their influence over government is keeping government from doing it. And the result, as we saw in the Angelo, the quotes from John Angelo in Baltimore, The results are being seen in our cities, in the slums, in the crime, in the drugs, in the violence. Consequently, government is becoming much more military-like. In fact, that was one of the major criticisms in Ferguson, Missouri, is that much of the military equipment that came back from the Middle East once the Iraq War, once American troops pulled out of Iraq, much of that military equipment ended up in the possession of our municipalities, our local police departments.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
I thought you'd like to know that you've got Harry on the line.
I do.
Yes, you do.
Oh, this is great. Well, thank you. We don't have a whole lot of time, but it's great to hear from him.
Go ahead, Harry.
Thank you, Bob. Hey, Harry.
Hello, Dr. Bill. I was reluctant to call in because I certainly did not want to interrupt your masterful lecture. And also, as you know, I'm very biased here because, of course, as you know, I've told you that I've been following the work of Richard Sennett since the 1970s when I saw him guest lecture in a college class. So I'm biased, and and I no question about that.
Well, I'm hoping that I'm doing him justice because I like you, I believe that the material you sent, it's all quotes from his books, but it's fantastic stuff. It's so rich and so deep and so significant in what it says. And I thank you so darn much for taking the time to do this. I'm hoping that I'm doing it justice.
Oh, no, you certainly are. And, I have to say, the main reason I've been following Professor Sennett's work is because I realized, even back when I first heard him, that as a sociologist, he just has this very creative, fertile mind, and he certainly doesn't write like a typical, or the stereotypical sociologist, He doesn't, use a lot of jargon, which people always complain about in sociology. And, in fact, he often brings in his own personal experiences as he's writing about even very sort of deep concepts. So,
right.
That's what makes him so interesting, at least to me. I just had a few comments, and I thought maybe this would be sort of the question and answer period at the end of the lecture. I don't know if it's...
Let's do that, because we can pick it up again tomorrow. Don't worry about it. This is great.
Okay. Well, these are just sort of a few, and these are... I guess they're more sort of like comments, just maybe even, and maybe your listeners don't need these clarifications, but I just thought I might want to help your listeners possibly about the things they might want to know. First thing was, you mentioned, Sennett, talks a lot about this, the German word Bildung and the idea of the formation of a life narrative. And I don't know if it helps your listeners at all, but, there's this concept of the word of Bildungsroman, which is, was a novel, which is in Europe in particular, particularly back in the 90s, young person, how their life was formed. And so that kind of novel was very popular. People like Herman of these kinds of novels, Goethe even earlier wrote, in fact, kind of an infamous of sorrows young Rosa became the protagonist committed suicide, attributed for reading that novel. So that was the first thing. But the other things are that, first of all, I just wanted to make it clear, only because I've read so many of his books, that I think Richard Sennett definitely does not, in a sense, in any way embrace the, sort of traditional idea of freedom. And he thinks that, the neoliberal or sort of even conservative ideas about freedom are vastly overrated. He really does not, and I don't want to spoil the end of the movie, but, he does not think that self-sufficiency is so terrific. He does not really believe in total independence. And in another book where I quoted just a few paragraphs that I also sent you, this is a book between the two books about the new capitalism. He wrote a book called Respect in a World of Inequality, where he talks about the fact that the only thing he can come up with, assuming the fact that the world will always, or that a society like ours will always be somewhat unequal in terms of, let's say, material wealth or something, is the idea of, first of all, he thinks that people should have autonomy, not freedom. but that autonomy involves things like mutual respect and recognition of people's dignity.
Right.
And he, in a sense, believes rather in interdependence rather than in independence.
Mm-hmm.
And this relates to something that he, I think, maybe didn't quite feel that he was getting at completely in that 1998 book that you referred to, which is called The Corrosion of Character, which again is about capitalism. But there he was thinking more about the problems to people and their individual ethics. And he really felt, even back then in 1998, that the so-called new capitalism or our new economic system was creating this monstrous problem of people feeling no longer needed in society. And that, in a sense, our economic system was, in fact, creating that rather than, assuaging it.
Right.
And he talked about how, he quoted a French philosopher saying that, you become reliable because someone is counting on you. And so you become accountable for your action, in a sense, as the philosopher put it, before another. And he says, in order to be reliable, we must feel needed. For us to feel needed, this other person must be needy. So he doesn't even disparage neediness. He doesn't think that if he thinks that, in a sense, that the new capitalists have stigmatized neediness too much, that they made it into a shameful thing. And, then I'm just reading, this is from this 1998 book. He says, who needs me is a question of character which suffers a radical challenge in modern capitalism. The system radiates indifference. And he talks about
that is so powerful, because even in this book on the so-called new capitalism, he talks an awful lot about what he calls the specter of uselessness.
Yes, and I didn't want to take away from that because I'm sure you'll be talking about that
No,
tomorrow.
I'll be talking about that tomorrow, yeah. But that fits right in with this.
But he's talking about not so much even about work, but just about the idea of who you are in society.
Right.
Because he says that, aside from the problem with the markets, he says the system radiates indifference in the organization of absence of trust, where there is no reason to be needed. And he says it does so through re-engineering of institutions in which people are treated as disposable. Such practices obviously and brutally diminish the sense of mattering as a person, of being necessary to others. And so I just wanted to, in a sense, sort of add that Richard Sennett really is, and certainly in that 2006 book where I think he's, in a sense, thought through a lot of these things even more, he's very worried about the way in which we have, these kind of cultural memes, about what our society is about, like self-sufficiency and all that, and about faith in the market. And I think he's basically saying that it's propaganda and it's very destructive. It's corrosive to people's lives and to society. And, he says that, for example, he says it could be said that capitalism was always thus, which is to say that it always brutally diminished the sense of mattering. He said, but not in the same way. He said the indifference of the old class-bound capitalism was starkly material. But the indifference which radiates out of flexible capitalism, which is what he's talking about when he says new capitalism, he says it's more personal. He says it's more personal because the system itself is less starkly etched, less legible in form. He says, thus the personal confusion today by answering the question, who in society needs me? So I just wanted to add, in a sense, to your listeners that he's very much aware of the way in which, even on a personal level, the economic system is, in a sense, destroying people's, not only their careers, but also, in a sense, their very sense of self. And I know that he talks about it again, but I just wanted to.
I appreciate that so much,
people.
And I wish we had more time, and I hope that you will. Please don't feel at all reluctant to call, because this is just wonderful stuff, and you bring so much to the whole discussion. It's great.
Well, I'm finished for today. I just wanted to add this few comments.
Okay,
and I'll let you get
Harry,
back.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everything you've
Thank
done.
you.
I appreciate the call today.
No, it's my pleasure to
Thank
help
you, my
you.
friend. Thank you again. Thank you so much. Well, we're just about at the end of our time together here at the Virtual Center today. We have 1 minute left in our program. So let me just take this opportunity first to thank Harry for the information and the commentary. And thank you for listening today to the Virtual Center. I hope that you'll be back tomorrow. We'll continue some of this material tomorrow because I think it is very rich, and I think Harry's enthusiasm and excitement is an indication of how rich it is. So for the Virtual Center, for the Head On Radio Network, Bob Kincaid and his folks, let me thank you and let me invite you to join us again tomorrow. Remember, we'll be beginning 1/2 hour later tomorrow, on the half hour rather than at the top of the hour. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe.